CC Michael, host of All Things Alberta, the podcast that knows that Alberta will be better off on our own, and we really don't care what people east of Saskatchewan thinks about it. Let's get after it. Good morning. Welcome, friends. As one of my colleagues would say as we walk into work. Funny guy. Welcome, friends. And it's a voice that you would never actually put with the guy's characteristics. Let's say that he's a big guy. But yeah, he's hilarious. Anyway, welcome, friends and frenemies. As far as I know, I don't have any enemies yet. And that's fine by me. I'm really not looking for any enemies. I'm looking for conversation. I'm looking for input. I'm looking for challenge. But I'm not looking for enemies. I'm just looking to have a conversation. And so I want to thank the friends and frenemies that I have that have reached out to me and talked to me about certain things. I want to thank those that responded to the last episode. That was a hard one. The good news for you is that I have notes again, so it's not going to be quite as rambly and scrambly, but I want to reiterate something, and that is that it's very, very frustrating, and it's hard to do any sort of show in which you want to discuss certain aspects of life and liberty and whatnot when you are scared to death of saying the wrong thing and being outed, being, losing your job over having a perspective that's not popular. And this is a problem. I watched a couple of videos just this morning even that inspired me to once again try again. One was of a black gentleman talking specifically about his experience and that what is needed in order to heal, he was an American, in order to heal the divide that he perceived in the U.S. and that was centered around the gospel of Jesus Christ, which was for you non-religious people that listen in. I might touch on, it's not might, I'm going to touch on this in today's conversation a little bit. So just a heads up, it might get a little preachy. I was a preacher for 5 years. I'm still a Christian, and so as much as this is about more about politics and more about maybe an independent Alberta, as my intro kind of alludes to, I cannot and will not hide the fact that my background is a Christian worldview, and so today I'm going to be touching on that a little bit, just to give you a heads up. And the other video was Ben Shapiro and Pierce Morgan. And this was a video from, I think, a couple of years ago that I stumbled into. And what they were talking about was the polarization of positions, and how language was being used as a weapon, and people were losing their job over having positions. Exactly what I was talking about earlier. And the worry that I was talking about last day when Stockwell Day loses his job because he dares defend Canada's institutions and businesses on record as not being racist, and he loses his jobs over it, that's disturbing. When you look at the number of incidences both in Canada and elsewhere where people do not feel free to be able to have a conversation, as I alluded to last day, that's a dangerous place for any country to go, and it's imperative that we all have a voice. So that includes those that I strongly disagree with. Please have a voice. Don't stop talking, but don't prevent me from talking either. And what I'm hoping to do is, through careful thought and process, to have a conversation. I think there are places where people are offside, and I think those people need to be called out. But how in the world can you call them out if you shut them down to the point where they're not allowed to talk? Do you think for a second that their positions change The challenge, and I see this from the likes of a Ben Shapiro and others, has long time been do not silence the idiots. Because once you silence the idiots, you don't change their mind. You just drive them underground. And once you drive them underground, that's where real problems begin, because they can foment all kinds of problems in society. They can quietly go about indoctrinating people's thoughts and radicalize them. The problem is radicalization. But in a free and open society where you can talk about difficult issues, you can present all kinds of different perspectives in a conversation, you can expose bad ideas. That's the point, is exposing bad ideas and showing them as being bad ideas. And the only way you can do that is through open dialogue. So I would encourage everybody, regardless of the political stripe you have, to be open and honest, and let's have conversation. So with that in mind, I want to talk today about racism and systemic racism. And I'm going to look a little bit at the US, but mostly I want to look at it from a Canadian perspective. And going back to the last show, one of the things that I had said was and addressed was my annoyance with the fact that Canada likes to look down our noses at the US. We tend to be a little elitist. We look at our American cousins and we think that they're crazy or idiots or whatever. And we make fun of them, not to their faces, because that would be rude. We don't want to be rude, Canadians, but we are rude. But the issue is that every cultural issue in the US finds its way into Canada. And it's often exacerbated by the very people that like to think of themselves as elitist compared to the US. It just doesn't make any rational sense. But this is what we see. And so what I'd like to do is challenge it a little bit with regards to our Canadian, from a Canadian or more Albertan point of view. And by the end of the show, what I want to do is I want to bring it back to what an independent Alberta might be able to look like with regards to some of these issues. Okay, so let's start with this: racism. Anytime we're talking about anything, we need to define our terms. And so what you want to do is everyone has this understanding. They all think they know what racism is until they bump up against a definition and they go, oh, I didn't realize that was the definition. So let's just look at the definition for a minute. You can see that there, even with my face on the screen. For those of you on podcast, I've just pulled up definition. According to this is definitions from Oxford Languages, and I've got one here from Wikipedia as well. So I've got two definitions, and I think they're both actually quite legitimate. Racism is a noun. Its first or primary definition, according to the Oxford language, is prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. The secondary definition says, the belief that all members of each race possess characteristics or abilities specific to that race, especially so as to distinguish it as inferior or superior to another race or races. So far, I think both of those definitions are bang on. This is what Wikipedia says. Racism is the belief that groups of humans possess different behavioral traits corresponding to physical appearance and can be divided based on the superiority of one race over another. That too is an adequate definition. So what we see is that it doesn't matter what race you are. And I'm going to talk about race. I'm going to do it now. How about this? From a Christian worldview, there's no such thing as race. There is only one race. It's called the human race. And so, as a Christian, we don't put away or deny the fact that there are ethnicities. So from a Christian worldview, we prefer the term ethnicities. We have different ethnic backgrounds. My ethnic background is English Scottish, basically UK. My wife is Irish, basically the UK, but different. And if you don't believe me, trust me, go there and ask an Irishman if he's an Englishman, or a Scot if he's an Englishman. You're going to get very different understanding. Why? Because they're different ethnicities, believe it or not. We're all white skinned, but so what? People from Slavic countries and Scandinavian countries and Russia and on. There's all kinds of different white people, but they all have different ethnicities. Regardless, we don't look upon the world, or at least we shouldn't look upon the world as races. However, for the sake of conversation and consistency of how the world uses terminology, I'll continue to use racism or race, although I fundamentally disagree with it. So we've looked at 3 different definitions here, all of which I agree with. But you'll notice that there's no specific race pointed out, right? It doesn't say people of the white race, if there is such a thing, that think of themselves as superior to other races. So this is what we call the traditional definition of racism, meaning anyone can be racist. Anyone. Doesn't matter what ethnicity you are, doesn't matter what race you are, if you want to go there. Anyone is capable of being a racist. This is being challenged in today's world, that minorities, and this is the interesting thing from a North American perspective, minorities are not able to be racist. There's all kinds of issues with that. The reason why they cannot be racist is because they lack power. So goes the argument. And it's just silly. It's silly on so many. You don't have then the definition of racism means nothing, right? My question back to those that believe that minorities in North America cannot be racist because they lack power, I want to switch that around then and say, does that mean that in the country of Japan, that Japanese are the racists? And they are racists by definition because they are a majority and they hold the power. So anyone in Japan who's not Japanese is therefore not capable of being racist. So if I were to move to Japan, does that mean that it doesn't matter if I were to think that all Japanese people were somehow lesser, that I am superior to them, that it doesn't matter? I'm not a racist because I don't hold any power in the country of Japan? That's silly. That's absolutely is it a non sequitur? It doesn't make any sense at all. And so therefore, if the premise doesn't hold in Japan, then it doesn't hold here. So therefore, the definition of racism has to be what's on the screen here. That anyone is capable of racism. Anybody is. And to some degree, well, I'll get to that in a minute. Okay. So my next question, or my next challenge, if you want to put it that way, and I want you to hear me carefully. I'm going to demonstrate in just a second why, according to a Christian worldview, racism is evil and wrong. And I hold to that. Racism of any kind is evil and wrong. But for those of you that do not hold to a Christian worldview, my question to you would be, especially the secular humanists / atheists or agnostics, my question to you is, if you believe racism is wrong, which I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt that all of you do, most, except for a tiny minority of fringe people, most people would argue that racism is wrong. And I would agree with you. My question to you is, why is it wrong? What is the basis of your objection? Why is it wrong? What is your justification to declare that racism is wrong? Now, I'm not going to answer that for you, but what I will say, and by all means, challenge me on it. Send me an email. Put a comment under the video here. If you're listening to podcast, ccmichael3520@gmail.com. Find me on Facebook, find me on Twitter, and please challenge me on this. But I would argue that anyone coming at racism from that perspective cannot give any justification to declare racism as being wrong. I would go so far, if we're going to dive into it a little deeper, we could declare that you have no justification for ethics at all from your worldview. And I know I've had this conversation with some people in the past, and I've upset a lot of people simply because I point out that your individual ethic, which is exactly what it is, your individual ethic inevitably becomes an opinion. An opinion doesn't equal objective fact, okay? And so therefore, you have no justification to declare racism as evil or wrong. It's just your opinion. Who cares what your opinion is? Who cares what my opinion is? If there's no objective justification, then you have to question the validity of your ethic, is what I'm saying. I hope that's clear. But I do want you to think clearly about, why is it wrong? I would challenge anyone, Christian included. By the way, let me clarify this. I am not saying that Christians are not capable of racism. That's not what I'm saying. Christians are capable of all kinds of evil because we are sinful creatures. We are fallen. And even if we are truly Christian, meaning that we are new creatures, as the Bible points out, if we are born again, if you want to use the language of John chapter 3, that we are still being sanctified. We're still growing in our faith. We're still reading our Bibles. We're still fighting what R.C. Sproul calls the dead old man that doesn't realize he's dead yet. We're not perfected this side of heaven. We still sin. We still sin in action, word, and deed, and some of those sins revolve around race. So please don't hear me say that Christians are not racist or can't be racist. They can, some are, some do, and it's still wicked and evil, and something of which we need to repent of. Okay? So I hope I made that crystal clear. Now, I said I was going to show you why, from a Christian perspective, that racism is bad. I think you can see it there. Genesis. I'm not getting too preachy here, but I could go on. There's lots and lots and lots of scriptures from the biblical perspective that show why racism is evil and wrong, but I'm just going to show you kind of the foundational one, and that is Genesis 1, verse 27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Simple. God made man in his image. He created the male and female. So this isn't a men are made in God's image and women are not. That's clear from the end of the verse 27. He created man and woman in his image, and man is therefore being created in the image of God is valuable. We are worthy of dignity and respect, and therefore it doesn't matter what I don't know. I mean, the idea that someone identifies themselves by the color of their skin, I'll go a step further. Those that identify themselves by their sexual orientation seems so shallow to me. Coming from a biblical perspective, you are made in the image and likeness of God. How do you get more intrinsic value than that? You'd have to deny God first and foremost, and then on top of that, then you start picking and choosing how you go about identifying yourself, because we are all, and I'm going to get to this later, but we're all tribal. Everybody is, okay? So, all races or ethnicities are descended from two individuals, and we are all descended from those two individuals, created by God in his own image. Racism is wrong. I'll ask again, from an atheistic evolutionary perspective, why is racism wrong? What makes it wrong? What justification do you have? And this is where I want to argue that racism is just one example of many that fall under the much more broad category of tribalism. All people are tribal. And we see this clearly in the Bible, and we can see it clearly in history. We're tribal. And depends on how we identify our tribe, depends on our sense of belonging. It depends on how or where we fit in. And there's been many studies done about just how tribal we are. Something I remember reading, that something as simple as splitting a workplace into two teams, one wearing red, one wearing blue, and then doing various I don't want to say experiments, but basically trying to figure out, do they identify with the tribe that they were just arbitrarily put into with regards to a color, red or blue, or whatever the colors were. It was just a t-shirt, man. That's the point. So suddenly you've got people from all different ethnicities on the same team wearing the same shirt, and suddenly everybody on that team, through the questions, tests, whatever they did to show the tribalism, identified that everybody wearing that same color shirt gave the benefit of the doubt to the people wearing the same color of their shirt. We are that hardwired for tribalism. And so it goes back to something that we were saying earlier. Do I wish that racism would go away? The answer is yes. I really do. And when we see Black Lives Matter movements, organizations, whatever you call it, marching, demanding, wanting equality, I'm not even going to get into statistics and facts which would argue strongly against the idea of systemic racism. I'm going to get into systemic racism a little bit here, but regardless, do we disagree with the premise that Black Lives Matter? I'll put it to you this way. I disagree with the organization. If you go to Black Lives Matter's website, I can't be on board with that. There is far too much Marxist garbage in there that's tied in with the idea that people with black skin are worthy. I've already determined that from a Christian perspective, of course, they're worthy of dignity, honor, and respect. Absolutely. Racism is evil. I can't speak about that enough. So when someone says to me, Black Lives Matter, my answer is, of course they do. Of course they do. I don't argue that. However, am I going to support an organization or marches, Black Lives Matter marches in Alberta? And the answer is no. And the reason behind it is because Black Lives Matter is terminology that is loaded with an organization that has, if you go to their organization, you'll see that maybe, and I think this happens more often than not, and I don't know if I'll have the time or the inclination to do the research, but just like I believe the environmental movement was probably started by people that meant well, that people saw the abuses that the environment was taking in certain areas, and then it was hijacked by other organizations in order to make money or politicize it. That's the biggest part, is the politicization, I hope I said that right, of movements that start off being what I'd call innocent. I have no reason to believe that Black Lives Matter didn't start off by being innocent. It reminds me of if it were to ever catch on, there's a group of people that wanted to do something to save babies, unborn babies nonetheless, in the U.S. And a gentleman, so they were going to go to an abortion clinic and plead with people to not kill their babies. And one of these gentlemen just took a piece of cardboard and wrote on it, babies are murdered here. That's all it said. And it wasn't in fancy, it was handwritten, babies are murdered here. And it was a movement. There's now 2 documentaries about babies are murdered here. I would encourage everyone, whether you're pro-abortion or pro-life, go watch them. Just watch them. Get informed. But I look at that and think, all it takes is for someone to politicize that, and they would politicize it, I believe, if it was. When I use the term zeitgeist, I don't know if it annoys people, but it's the spirit of the age, the direction where the wind is blowing. I don't know what you want to call it. It's just easy to call it the zeitgeist. If the zeitgeist were ever to blow in the direction of pro-life, I believe that babies are murdered here would be hijacked and politicized and made into something that first individual, that beautiful black man that made that babies are murdered here sign, something that he would probably want nothing to do with. And so we have to be careful about the politicization, I think that's a word, the politicization of movements that started off innocent. And I think Black Lives Matter was one of them. But it has been highly politicized. And if you go to the website and hit the donate, guess where that money goes? Anyone who donates to Black Lives Matter, you're donating to the Democratic Party. It has been politicized. Okay? And so, with that, I want to go on to systemic racism. We'll start off, again, systemic racism. So we understand what racism was. We've shown the definition there, but now we want to go to systemic racism. And here's the problem. When I punched up systemic racism, it came up with there was only really one definition. There's some videos or something that try to explain systemic racism, but the only one I could find was from Wikipedia on the right. Oh, sorry. I'll for those of you that are watching live, there you go. All we could find is something called institutional racism, and I think that's the same idea. Okay? So institutional racism is a form of racism expressed in the practice of social and political institutions. It is reflected in disparities regarding wealth, income, criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, political power, and education, among other factors. So I don't necessarily disagree with this definition, but my question would be, how is it expressed in the practice of political and social institutions. Um, so I'm going to get to something in a minute. It's an interview that Global had with the commissioner of the RCMP, where she even expressed her difficulty with the definition when Global decided that they were going to corner her into. Well, I'll get to it. It was an embarrassing interview as far as I'm concerned. But what I want to do is I want to show you unequivocally that there has been institutional racism. There has, both in the U.S. and I'll show you in Canada. And let's start with Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws in the U.S., if you're not familiar with Jim Crow laws were state and local laws that enforced racial segregation in the southern U.S. All were enacted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by, oh, look at that, white, Democratic-dominated state legislatures to disenfranchise and remove political and economic gains made by blacks during the Reconstruction period. Those were racist laws, and they were laws, meaning if there were a restaurant, let's say, a restaurant that did not want segregation, they wanted anybody and everybody to come in and eat at their restaurant. It was illegal for them to allow blacks or whites, depending on who owned the restaurant, to eat at that establishment. That's outright racism. I think we can all agree with that. So therefore, I think we can all agree that Jim Crow laws specifically are a specific example of systemic racism. I have no problem with that. Okay? Jim Crow laws have been outlawed, by the way. They have been for years and years. And if you look here, there's people also ask, what were Jim Crow laws and how they were applied? What are some examples of Jim Crow laws? What were some of the Jim Crow laws? And who fought Jim Crow laws? That would be really, really interesting for people to maybe click on. I think you'll be shocked. Just like most people aren't aware that it was the DNC who brought in Jim Crow laws in the first place. However, let's move along. The next one I want to do is let's Canadianize this for a second. Okay. So what I have here is an interview, and am I going to play? I don't think I'm going to play it, but I'm definitely going to. I've already shared it on social media. I shared it on Facebook and Twitter, and it is regarding the Indian Act. So what we have here is the Indian Act of 1876 was, as it says here, I'll just read what it says here, has structured the relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples with profound repercussions. And so there's a guy here called, the author's called Bob Joseph. And if you watch the interview is about 28 minutes long, where he explains the Indian Act. And he wrote a book. What was the book called? 21, there it is in the bottom right-hand corner. 21 Things That You May Not Know About the Indian Act. I watched the interview, and it was shocking. I've read the Indian Act. Maybe my reading comprehension isn't that strong, but it was funny because I learned things from this interview. I knew about some of the stuff in here, but as Bob Joseph, by the way, he's a native himself. As Bob Joseph explained, there are 21 major things in that Indian Act that are still in play today. And this Indian Act is, as far as I'm concerned, it's Canada's apartheid. It is Canada's racist. You want to talk about systemic racism? I used to get upset when people would say, Canada is has systemic racism, and I'd be like, come on, no, it doesn't. But then I thought, wait a second, I've been saying for years that the Indian Act is a racist document. Yeah, there it is. There's Canada's systemic racism found here, which is what really, really bothers me when small town Alberta, actually, as far as I'm concerned, anywhere in Canada, but especially when I see Black Lives Matter marches in Calgary and Edmonton, and then they bring this movement to small town Alberta, Innisfail being one. I have a history in Innisfail. Wonderful, beautiful redneck people. They're hardworking. When I say redneck, I don't mean that in a like. Look at me, I'm a redneck, but I'm not a racist either, and neither are they. Predominantly, they don't care. Are you a hardworking person? Do you like to have a good time? Are you? They're just a typical small town Alberta town. They don't care what color you are. Like, they just don't care. Live and let live is what I saw when I spent time in Innisfail. Live and let live. Whatever you want to do. They were actually a very welcoming. If you wanted to be involved with the community, they're very welcoming. And so the idea that it really disappointed me that these urbanites on Twitter decided to attack Innisfail because Innisfail fought back when they first heard that this Black Lives Matter march was coming to their town. There were some things said on social media. Number one, I'm not going to defend anything that was said on social media. I don't. A, you can't even prove that they're from there. B, just because there's a couple bad apples in a town does not mean you get to broad brush the entire town as being racist. Okay, that's ridiculous. And so, anyway, that didn't stop urbanites from Calgary and Edmonton from declaring the entire town as being racist. I just find that as somebody who lived and worked in Innisfail, who has family that lives and works in the Innisfail area, it's disgusting. I find it disgusting. You don't know what the hell you're talking about, and I take it personally. In Innisfail, you're going to meet some of the nicest people you'll ever meet. They give you a shirt off their back, right? Just like you will in Cochrane, just like you will in any other place. So it really bothers me when I see things like that. Anyway, my point is that when you see Black Lives Matter marches in these towns in Canada, yet racism against blacks is not our issue. Sorry. It's just systemically, it's not our issue. And what's frustrating is that we do have a systemic problem. We do have systemic racism. It's called First Nations people, Indigenous people, Natives, whatever you want to call them. Not pejoratively speaking. However, they are our systemic racism in Canada. How come we're not having Native Lives Matter marches? You know what I mean? Like, why are we adopting problems that aren't our problems? Why are we adopting U.S. issues when we clearly have our own Canadian issues to deal with? Going to get me fired up here. Today's examples. Okay, so what I wanted to do is I wanted to find some examples with regards to systemic racism. When people are talking about systemic racism, what are they talking about? So this is from the ACLRC, which is the Calgary Anti-Racism Education Group. And it was really, I encourage you to go here just so you can see the sorts of stuff that are being propagated in our system, which are beyond frustrating. So in this, for example, it talks about school curricula claims to be inclusive and representative, and there have been some significant improvements in curricula development and delivery in recent decades. However, these shifts towards inclusiveness are often problematic, resulting in a lack of engagement/participation of Indigenous students and students of color because, number one, point one, the foundational perspective from which the curricula is developed is still white, middle-class, Western. Right. For example, the story of Canada remains a white people's story, but now with Indigenous people and people of color added as in scare quotes. The voices, perspectives of marginalized communities, their own experiences of this place are not heard directly because the story is still told by predominantly white curriculum developers speaking for these communities. I would highly question what these people know about curriculum development and who's involved. I've been a teacher for 20 years. I remember the history that we were teaching. The whole history started for Canadian history. The whole Canadian history curriculum started with the natives. The first 3 chapters were nothing but natives. The other thing about this is that we all have perspectives. We all have worldviews, and I'm not saying that how does that expression go? In history, the winners are the ones that get to describe the history, right? Which of course is going to be from a certain perspective. I'm not saying that there isn't certain perspectives in history, and I'm not saying that they're all correct or incorrect. But when you talk about education, especially in the province of Alberta, is that it has been largely settled by white settlers. There is, of course, a native story to be not just included, but I think is vital to the story. And I think that educators over the last 30 years, as you said earlier, that there have been some significant improvements. Well, where did those improvements come from? Do you think that's white people telling natives what their history is? Of course not. They've been included in the process of writing the curriculum. This is garbage, right? This applies most obviously, it says, to social studies, history, and so on, but also to math and science, which are Western European based. Not to stir the pot, but most of the scientific breakthroughs over the last 2,000 years have come from a variety of different cultures. And it's unfortunate to say, and I don't mean it in any sort of racist fashion whatsoever, it's just a matter of fact, is that native groups in the Americas largely did not advance far in the scientific realm. So therefore, what are we supposed to teach when it comes to, and believe me, the science curriculum in Alberta bends over backwards to include anything and everywhere where native contributions to science are valid. They're in there. We have to teach on them. They're there. But we really can't talk about a lot of scientific advancements in the North American native culture when, and that can be for a variety of reasons. I would start with, especially in the northern climates here, survival was hard enough. They didn't have a lot of leisurely time to gaze at the stars and figure certain things out. They didn't have the luxury that they did in other parts of the world where they had advanced to the point where they didn't have to worry about starving to death every year. The other aspect that I find totally and completely frustrating by this is that everybody has a history. And I remember sitting at the University of Lethbridge in one of my classes, and one of my native friends, who I love and respect very, very much, came into our one of our Native American classes and gave a brief history. I don't remember exactly what the point was, but he made the claim, and I remember almost walking out of the classroom. I was so angry because it was just so. You want to talk about revisionist history, where this man, this Native individual that I love and respect to this day, got up in the class and said that natives did not kill anybody in war until the white man came. They did this version, I just forget the name of it, when they try to get up and basically touch tag. I'd have to look up what that term is, but this is what the claim was: is that natives never killed anybody in war. They never did any of this stuff. By the way, natives enslaved one another. Natives killed one another. The idea that natives were somehow innocent people before the white man came is just absolutely ridiculous. It's silly. And so natives have a history as well. We all have a history. That's the point. We all have a history. And none of it, if we shine a light on it, none of it's really good. All right? None of it is really good. And so anyhow, my point is that it doesn't matter from what perspective you've got in this instance. Is it better to have my native friend get up and tell what I call fairy tales that are obviously wrong? He believes that history. He believes that natives never killed one another until white man came. Is that better? Is that a better history? Is that a more correct history? How about we have conversations about what we know and what the truth is, and it's okay to have disagreements, but this whole idea that our education is an example of systemic racism. The other aspect on here is that how many different people groups do we have in this country? And are we supposed to have a chapter for every single one of them so that they can feel, what was the terminology here, so they can feel included and participate? Like if I go to another country, do I expect Japan? I'll keep Japan because Japan's very one, what do you call it? One culture in Japan, one people in Japan, one ethnicity in Japan. If I go and move to Japan, am I supposed to stand and scream about the discrimination that they're not talking about my white history, and in such a way that I'm not offended by it, or whatever it is? It's just silly. It's unrealistic, and I would encourage you to go through here. Hiring and advancement practices, access to sports. One of the most frustrating things I saw on here. Here's issues. I went to the next page. Inherent problems. So this is talking about multicultural educator versus an anti-racism facilitator. So they are promoting this anti-racism facilitator and trying to show the lack of or the downfalls of a multicultural educator. And basically what I got out of this when I read it was that if you're white, don't bother. Right? If you're white, don't bother. We can't even help ourselves. And this is the message that's going on lately, is that white people can't even help themselves. We are just part of the problem, and it's our whiteness that's part of the problem. By the way, that's called racism. If you haven't picked up on that, that's called racism, right? Elizabeth May. Elizabeth May. What do I say about Elizabeth May? Elizabeth May said, after she was arrested, and even since then, she's doubled down on it. Elizabeth May says the entire RCMP force is racist. Quote, I think the RCMP is a racist institution, and I say this carefully. You want to talk about somebody who is fully acknowledging that what they are saying is probably going to ruffle some feathers, and she doesn't care because she's thought about it, and she's come to the conclusion that the RCMP is racist. Quote, when you think of it, it comes from the top down, so contrast the careful, respectful, beautiful way in which the RCMP arrested me in March 2018 in the Kinder Morgan protest with the organized top-down decisions to militarize the police force. Elizabeth May and think are words that should never be put together, because Elizabeth May is not a thinker. And the fact that she can't figure out, like, here, I'm looking at the picture, and it looks like one of the RCMP officers that is arresting her is a native. I might have it wrong. It's not the clearest picture there, but he's definitely not white. They're escorting this old crazy lady who is there for a photo op, and she's trying to compare her arrest with the arrest of other criminals. Like, are you serious? Quote, I think the reason I got arrested nicely is because I'm white. What? Quote, I'm afraid my experience is that we need to really consider that it's not the random bad apple. This is decision-making within the institution itself that decides that Indigenous protesters can be treated one way and white protesters another way. Sure. This is not a person who thinks. This is not a person who can think rationally. This is not a person who, maybe she is, but she's just so politicized that everything has to be politicized, and she's politicized this. It's ridiculous. Move on, because we're already at 50 minutes. I thought today was going to be like a 25, 30-minute video, and here we are at minute 50 already. I want to play for you. Hopefully this works, because I've had it loaded for a couple of days. I want to play for you just the first minute of an interview with Global and the head of the RCMP. And listen carefully. I hope this comes through well.
Joining me now is the Commissioner of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Brenda Lucki. Thank you for joining us, Commissioner.
Thank you, Mercedes.
There's been a lot of discussion around systemic racism and policing. Do you believe that there's systemic racism in the RCMP?
You know, it's a question I haven't been struggling with, but I've been struggling with the definition of systemic racism. And when I think of unconscious bias, there is unconscious bias in the RCMP, most definitely. And there is, we live in a society where the inequities persist, and police are part of that society. And so, yes, we have a responsibility to promote that inclusion and make sure we don't have that racism.
So does that mean that you do believe there's systemic racism in the force, or just unconscious bias?
Before I let her answer this question, please recognize what just happened in that question. This is similar to, have you stopped beating your wife? It doesn't matter how she answers this question. She has been cornered by, I don't know the name of the lady in Ottawa there, the Global lady that's interviewing. That is a gotcha question. It does not matter how the commissioner of the RCMP answers that question. She is admitting guilt with the RCMP, that the RCMP is racist, whether it's unconsciously or not, whether it's consciously or unconsciously. The RCMP is a racist organization. This was an either or question, and both of them are bad. This is such garbage. Gotcha. And I wish the commissioner had called her out on the question, because it's a brutal question.
No, I think there's times when our members don't act according to our core values, including racism. And when that happens, we need to hold those members to account.
So we're racist. Listen, I don't mind the rest of her answer there. You're not going to get rid of all the bad apples. I don't care. And I said last day, you take the city of Calgary, for instance, that has something like 3,300 police officers. They do their best to hire the best, most qualified people for that job, and the vast majority of them are decent, hardworking people. But there are bad apples everywhere, and you're going to get some that slip through, that are racist, that are ill-tempered, that shouldn't be part of the job, and it happens. And so when they are exposed, they do need to be dealt with. Now, I'm not going to get into the issues of unions and everything else. Can we all just agree that where problems arise, problems need to be dealt with? Can we all agree with that? I think we can. So let's do that, but let's not paint entire police forces with a broad brush of you're institutionally racist. It's not fair to those that aren't, and so on. So here's, am I in comments yet? I think I am. Here's just a couple of comments. I don't know if I've covered them all yet, but so it doesn't matter what policies are put in place. You're still a racist, and the system is still racist. That's largely what I'm getting from lots of the feedback and lots of the like I've had conversations on social media, and I know I've said this numerous times. Maybe that's not the smartest place to have conversations, but the fact of the matter is that the message I'm getting as a white person is that I'm white and I'm a racist and there's nothing I can do about it. So if there's nothing I can do about it, then why are we talking about it? Like, whatever. Elizabeth May was arrested in kind because it was a publicity stunt, and she's an old crazy bat lady. Number 3, RCMP and other various government organizations trip all over themselves to hire minorities. They trip all over themselves to hire minorities. Job postings have even said for non-whites only. Now, not speaking about the RCMP here. You haven't seen that, but there have been numerous places in the public and private sector where overt racism has been there, except it's been racism against white people. If you're white, don't apply. How come no one wants to talk about that? The reason why they don't want to talk about that is because in their minds that's not racism. Only white people can be racist, which is racist. Number 4, popular terms such as unconscious bias, inequities, white privilege are making a roaring comeback. Folks, these terms are gaslighting terms used to make a predominantly Western culture and ideology that happens to be predominantly white-skinned feel bad about things that they had nothing to do with. It doesn't matter that I think racism is evil, racism is bad, racism should be gone. It doesn't matter because I'm a racist, because I'm white. I wish the woke left could see how frustrating that this is, or even in themselves. I don't know, all the self-loathing that I see from lefties with regards to tripping over themselves, trying to be as woke as possible is just unbelievable. I have written here white privilege pandering, but I don't remember what that was, so I'll just leave that alone for now. So get to the final point here in our last couple minutes. An independent Alberta. How does an independent Alberta fix this? I don't know if fixing it is a correct terminology, but an independent Alberta actually gives us a fresh start. What do I mean by a fresh start? Well, all government organizations start off with equality regarding all their policies. Now, they've largely already done that. Not largely. I think I'll bet you if you look at any government policy anywhere, it is expressly anti-racist. It is an open door policy for the most qualified get in. If you're qualified, you're in. They don't tolerate racism. They don't tolerate prejudice. They don't tolerate all these things. It's already written in the policies, but I think a fresh start, a fresh government, a fresh country can start off on the right foot without a lot of baggage. An independent Alberta would absolutely scrap the Indian Act. That's what it's called, the Indian Act of 1876. And First Nations groups or tribes are recognized, and I have to be careful with my terminology here because most natives that I've talked to if you were to say we would give the people, we would give First Nations autonomy, they would rightly, I believe, they would rightly point out that it's not ours to give. What do you mean giving it to us? So yeah, we have to be careful of our terminology. So I think recognize is a better word. So First Nations groups and tribes are recognized as autonomous and are also true partners in a new Alberta. They are no longer third-class citizens. They have the rights and freedoms of every other person in Alberta. They are no longer persona non grata. They're no longer stuck on reserves and treated as third-class citizens. First Nations groups would be recognized as being autonomous. What they do with their land is their business. I actually really like what Jeff Rout said in a couple interviews ago, where we would use the Switzerland model of I think they're called cantons, where they would have their own cantons, and what they do, the laws they have in their own cantons are entirely up to them. They're autonomous. They can tax as they wish. They can have as much autonomy as possible, and that would make them true partners in a free and democratic Alberta. Immigration reform would be based upon local needs. We won't have necessarily. We won't be told by Ottawa, a city 2,000 miles away, telling us what our immigration policies are, or who we have to take, or who we don't have to take, or whatever. An independent Alberta can sort of wipe the slate clean and start fresh, and this would be good for everybody. I encourage you to get a hold of me to talk about what you've heard today. I know I've said something's off the cuff that you might want to challenge me on. That's fine. You know how to get a hold of me. Leave your comments underneath the video. Again, if you are on podcast, you can contact me through Twitter, Facebook. I think I'm on Instagram even. And where else? Email, as I said earlier, ccmichael3520@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you, and we'll talk soon. Thanks, folks.